My beloved child. Someone is crying today. Not tears of regret. Not tears of loss. Not tears born from fear. These are tears that arrive when a heart finally begins to understand that something it prayed for long ago may be closer than it ever imagined. And the strange part is this. You do not yet know why. At this very moment, while you are listening to these words, there are emotions moving quietly behind the scenes of your life. Conversations you have not heard. Thoughts that were never spoken aloud. Realizations that happened in complete silence. You may believe nothing has changed. You may look around and see the same routine, the same unanswered questions, the same waiting. But there are shifts occurring where your eyes cannot see. And one particular person has felt those shifts more strongly than anyone else. For a long time, they carried feelings they could not fully explain. Feelings that appeared unexpectedly. Feelings that remained even when logic told them they should disappear. No matter how many distractions entered their life. No matter how many responsibilities demanded their attention. A certain thought always found its way back. A certain face. A certain connection. A certain sense that something unfinished remained between two souls walking separate paths. Yet this is not where the story truly begins. Because what happened today was set in motion much earlier. Long before this morning. Long before this week. Perhaps even long before either of you understood the purpose behind the delays. You have asked questions in private moments. Questions you never fully shared with anyone else. Why has this taken so long? Why did certain doors close? Why did some relationships fail despite your efforts? Why did answers seem delayed when your heart felt ready? Those questions were not ignored. Every disappointment taught something. Every delay protected something. Every season of loneliness prepared something. And now, pieces that once seemed unrelated are beginning to fit together. Imagine a quiet room this morning. The sunlight barely touching the edge of a table. A cup of coffee growing cold. Thoughts wandering where they were never expected to go. That is where something unexpected happened. Not a dramatic event. Not a miracle falling from the sky. Something far more powerful. A realization. A simple realization that arrived without warning. The kind that causes a person to stop what they are doing and stare into the distance. The kind that makes old memories suddenly appear with new meaning. The kind that changes how the future looks. At first, they resisted it. Most people do. Because genuine emotions can be frightening when they become impossible to deny. Especially after years of protecting oneself from disappointment. Especially after convincing oneself to move on. Especially after learning how to hide vulnerable feelings behind a calm expression. But truth has a remarkable way of finding the surface. And today, truth became difficult to ignore. What they suddenly understood brought tears to their eyes. Not because they were sad. Because they finally saw something that had been hidden in plain sight. Something connected to you. Something connected to the journey both of you have been living separately. If this sounds familiar. If you have spent nights wondering whether your patience meant anything. If you have quietly carried hope while pretending to be strong. Then listen carefully. Because there is another piece of this story nobody expected. Someone else noticed the change. Someone who was never supposed to play a significant role. Someone who observed a conversation. Someone who heard a name. Someone who recognized an emotion that could no longer be concealed. And what this person decided to do next would begin a chain of events neither of you saw coming. But that was not the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything happened later. Behind a closed door. During a conversation that was never meant to reach your ears. A conversation that revealed a truth so unexpected. That even the people sitting in that room fell completely silent. And the first words spoken after that silence were, Not what anyone expected. The silence lingered for several seconds. No one rushed to fill it. No one laughed it away. No one changed the subject. Because the truth that had just been spoken carried a weight that could not be ignored. The room felt different. You know the kind of moment. The kind when a single sentence suddenly causes years of assumptions to crumble. The kind when people realize they have misunderstood something important for a very long time. One person lowered their eyes. Another slowly leaned back in their chair. And the individual whose heart had been holding so much inside finally stopped pretending. Not because they planned to reveal anything. Not because they wanted attention. But because keeping everything hidden had become harder than telling the truth. For years, they had convinced themselves that certain feelings would fade. That time would erase them. That life would eventually lead them in another direction. Yet every road seemed to circle back to the same place. Every major decision somehow carried your shadow. Every important milestone reminded them of something unfinished. And that realization became impossible to deny. But what nobody in that room understood was why this realization was happening now. Why today? Why after all this time? Why after so many delays, disappointments, and unanswered questions? The answer was quietly unfolding long before anyone noticed. Because while they were wrestling with their emotions, you were changing too. You may not realize it. In fact, you may have spent recent months feeling overlooked. You may have wondered whether your efforts mattered. You may have questioned whether anyone truly saw the strength it took to keep moving forward. But heaven often does its deepest work in hidden seasons. The growth that changes a life rarely happens in front of an audience. It happens during lonely evenings. It happens after difficult goodbyes. It happens through silent prayers. It happens when nobody applauds your courage. And that is exactly where your transformation began. Without realizing it, you became stronger. Wiser. More compassionate. More patient. You stopped chasing things that were not meant for you. You began protecting your peace. You started healing wounds that others never knew existed. And that healing created a shift. A shift that could be felt far beyond your immediate surroundings. The person connected to this story felt it. Even if they could not explain how. Even if they could not put it into words. Something about you no longer felt distant. No longer felt unreachable. No longer felt lost in the past. And that frightened them at first. Because hope can be intimidating after disappointment. Hope asks people to become vulnerable again. Hope asks people to believe again. Hope asks people to risk their hearts once more. Yet despite their fears, something kept pulling them toward a realization they could no longer avoid. Then came the unexpected moment. A memory surfaced. Not a dramatic memory. Not a grand romantic scene. Something simple. A conversation. A look. A small act of kindness. A moment many people would have forgotten. But suddenly that memory returned with astonishing clarity. And when it did, everything changed. Because they finally understood what made you different. It was never perfection. It was never appearance. It was never circumstances. It was something much deeper. The way you cared when nobody was watching. The way you remained kind after being hurt. The way you continued believing despite disappointment. The way you carried quiet strength through seasons that would have broken many others. And when that realization settled into their heart, the tears came. Not dramatic tears. Not desperate tears. Just the kind that appear when someone realizes they almost overlooked a blessing. The kind that arrive when gratitude and emotion meet at the same moment. But here is what makes this story even more remarkable. Someone else witnessed those tears. Someone who had previously been skeptical. Someone who once questioned whether these feelings were real. Someone whose opinion carried far more influence than anyone realized. They watched carefully. They listened closely. And for the first time, their perspective began to change. What they saw convinced them that this was not a passing emotion. Not wishful thinking. Not temporary excitement. Something genuine was unfolding. And before the day ended, that person made a quiet decision. A decision they shared with only one other individual. A decision that would eventually create an opportunity neither of you expected. Yet what happened next was never meant to be revealed. Because later that evening, a message arrived. A message connected to a name. A message connected to a conversation. A message connected to a truth that had remained hidden for far too long. And when those words were finally read, everything inside that room changed. Everything inside that room changed. Not because the message was dramatic. Not because it contained shocking news. But because of who sent it. For a moment, nobody spoke. The words on the screen were simple. Yet sometimes the simplest words carry the greatest power. The person holding the message read it once. Then again. And then a third time. As though their heart was searching for confirmation that what they were seeing was real. Because hidden within those few lines was something they had not expected to find. A sign. Not the kind people imagine when they think of grand revelations. A quieter sign. A more meaningful one. The kind that arrives when life gently whispers that a chapter is about to change. And suddenly, events that once seemed unrelated began connecting together. The delayed conversations. The unexpected memories. The emotions that surfaced without warning. The tears. The silence. The growing sense that something important was approaching. None of it was random. None of it was meaningless. And deep down, they knew it. That knowledge brought both comfort and uncertainty. Because recognizing a blessing is one thing. Knowing what to do next is something else entirely. So they sat quietly. Thinking. Reflecting. Remembering. Hours passed. Yet their thoughts kept returning to the same place. To you. Meanwhile, you may have been going about your day completely unaware. Handling responsibilities. Caring for others. Managing challenges that nobody fully understands. Perhaps smiling while carrying burdens you rarely discuss. Perhaps wondering if anyone truly sees the sacrifices you have made. If that sounds familiar, hear this clearly. Nothing you have endured has been wasted. The nights you cried in private. The prayers you whispered when nobody else could hear. The moments you chose grace instead of bitterness. The times you remained faithful despite uncertainty. Those moments mattered more than you realize. Because every one of them shaped the person you are becoming. And the remarkable thing is this. The very qualities you developed during those difficult seasons are now being recognized by people who once overlooked them. Including someone whose heart has been changing far more rapidly than they expected. But that is only part of the story. Because later that evening, another conversation began. A conversation few people know about. It happened in a calm setting. No raised voices. No arguments. Just honest words exchanged between people who cared deeply about what was unfolding. One question was asked. A question that seemed simple on the surface. Yet it carried enormous significance. Are you absolutely sure? The room became quiet again. The answer did not come immediately. The person being questioned looked down. Took a slow breath. And then responded with a confidence that surprised even them. Not confidence born from excitement. Not confidence born from fantasy. Confidence born from clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives after years of confusion. The kind that arrives when the heart finally stops fighting what it already knows. The people listening exchanged glances. Because they could hear something different in that voice. Something steady. Something sincere. Something real. And that is when another unexpected shift occurred. Support began to replace doubt. Understanding began to replace skepticism. Questions that once created distance began creating connection. It was subtle. Almost invisible. Yet powerful. Like the first light appearing before sunrise. You cannot fully see the day yet. But you know it is coming. And while all of this was happening, there was one detail nobody in that room realized. One detail hidden beneath every conversation. One detail connected directly to your journey. Because at nearly the same moment these discussions were taking place, you were facing a decision of your own. Perhaps you have not made it yet. Perhaps you are standing at a crossroads right now. Wondering whether to keep believing. Wondering whether to let go of old disappointments. Wondering whether hope is still worth carrying. That choice matters more than you know. Because the path opening ahead requires something many people struggle to embrace. Trust. Not blind trust. Not naive trust. The kind that comes from understanding that delays are not always denials. That unanswered prayers are not always forgotten prayers. That what appears absent may simply be arriving by a different route than expected. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because just when everyone thought they finally understood what was happening, a truth emerged that nobody had considered. A truth connected to a family member. Someone who had been quietly observing everything from the background. Someone who rarely shared their opinions. Someone whose next words would influence every conversation that followed. When they finally decided to speak, the entire room turned toward them. And the first sentence that came out of their mouth revealed a secret they had been carrying for months. A secret connected to you. A secret connected to a promise. And a secret connected to a moment that happened long ago. A moment nobody believed they remembered. A moment nobody believed they remembered. Yet somehow, they did. The room fell completely silent as the family member began to speak. Their voice was calm. Measured. Thoughtful. The kind of voice people listen to when they know something meaningful is about to be revealed. For months, they had remained quiet. Not because they had nothing to say. But because they were waiting. Watching. Observing details that everyone else seemed to miss. Now, for the first time, they were ready to share what they had seen. I noticed it long ago, they said softly. The words immediately captured everyone's attention. Because nobody expected that response. Nobody expected them to admit they had been aware of something for so long. And certainly nobody expected what came next. They described a memory. A seemingly ordinary moment from the past. A gathering. A conversation. A brief interaction that lasted only minutes. Most people had forgotten it completely. But they had not. Because while everyone else focused on what was being said, they had been paying attention to what was felt. The energy in the room. The unspoken emotions. The quiet understanding that seemed to exist beneath the surface. And what they noticed that day stayed with them. For years. At the time, they chose not to mention it. Life moved on. Circumstances changed. Paths separated. Questions remained unanswered. Yet that memory never disappeared. Instead, it quietly waited. Like a seed beneath the soil. Invisible. Silent. Growing in ways nobody could see. And now, suddenly, it all made sense. As they continued speaking, expressions around the room began to change. People who once doubted became thoughtful. People who once questioned became curious. People who once dismissed certain possibilities found themselves reconsidering everything. Because the picture was becoming clearer. Not complete, but clearer. And with every new detail, one realization grew stronger. This connection had survived things that should have ended it. Time had not erased it. Distance had not erased it. Disappointment had not erased it. Life itself had not erased it. Something deeper remained. Something steady. Something patient. Something that continued quietly beneath the surface even when nobody acknowledged it. Meanwhile, you may have been feeling something difficult to explain. Perhaps a strange sense of anticipation. Perhaps moments when memories appeared unexpectedly. Perhaps a feeling that change was approaching without knowing why. Many people dismiss these moments. They call them coincidence. They tell themselves they are imagining things. Yet sometimes the heart notices shifts before the mind understands them. Sometimes peace arrives before answers. Sometimes healing arrives before explanations. And sometimes a new chapter begins before the old one has fully closed. That is why this season feels different. Not because everything has already happened, but because movement has begun. The pieces are no longer standing still. And that matters more than you realize. Then came another surprising development. One person in the room asked a question nobody expected. A question so direct that everyone immediately turned their attention toward the answer. What happens now? The words lingered in the air. Because that was the question everyone secretly wanted to ask. What happens now? After the realizations. After the tears. After the conversations. After the hidden truths finally began surfacing. What happens now? For several moments, nobody responded. Not because there was no answer. But because the answer carried weight. Real change always does. Eventually, someone spoke. And their response was surprisingly simple. We stop fighting what has already become clear. Those words settled over the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just undeniable. Because clarity has a way of bringing peace. The exhausting struggle begins to fade. The endless questioning begins to soften. And space opens for something new. Something hopeful. Something genuine. Yet even then, the biggest revelation had not arrived. In fact, nobody present realized that the most important piece of the puzzle was still missing. A piece connected not to the past, but to the future. A future that was already beginning to take shape. Because earlier that same day, far from that room, another conversation had taken place. A conversation nobody there knew about. A conversation involving someone whose role in this story had remained hidden until now. Someone connected to a decision. Someone connected to an opportunity. Someone connected to an unexpected door that was quietly beginning to open. And when news of that conversation finally reached the room, the reaction was immediate. Faces changed. Eyes widened. Breaths caught. Because the information confirmed something nobody had dared say aloud. The timing was no longer accidental. The pieces were aligning. The delays were ending. And for the first time, everyone could see the outline of what was coming. But there was one final detail. One detail so surprising that it explained why happy tears had appeared in the first place. A detail connected to a promise made long ago. A promise that had never been broken. A promise that was about to be fulfilled. And the person who held the key to that promise had just decided to make a call. To someone whose name had not been spoken until that very moment. To someone whose name had not been spoken until that very moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. Not because anyone feared what might happen. But because they sensed they were standing at the edge of something meaningful. The kind of moment people remember years later. The kind of moment that quietly changes the direction of a story. The person holding the phone looked down at the screen. For a few seconds, they simply stared. As though reflecting on everything that had led to this point. The years of waiting. The misunderstandings. The unanswered questions. The moments when hope felt fragile. Then, with a calm determination, they made their decision. The call would be made. Yet before a single number was dialed, something unexpected happened. The family member who had shared the hidden memory spoke again. This time, their voice carried emotion. Not sadness. Not regret. Gratitude. Deep gratitude. Because they suddenly understood something that had been invisible for a very long time. What everyone had been calling delay had actually been preparation. The room became still. Those words settled into every heart present. Preparation. Not punishment. Not rejection. Not loss. Preparation. How many times had people mistaken waiting for failure? How many times had they assumed silence meant nothing was happening? How many times had they walked away from hope just before understanding arrived? The truth was difficult to ignore. The timing that once felt unfair now seemed purposeful. Every challenge had shaped someone. Every disappointment had created wisdom. Every closed door had redirected a path. And when viewed together, those experiences formed a picture nobody could see before. A picture that pointed directly toward this moment. If you have ever questioned why your journey unfolded the way it did. If you have ever wondered why certain prayers seemed delayed. If you have ever carried silent disappointment while trying to remain faithful. This part of the story is for you. Because sometimes the answer arrives long after the question. And when it finally does, it reveals that nothing was wasted. Not your tears. Not your patience. Not your resilience. Not even the seasons that felt lonely. Especially those seasons. For it is often in solitude that the heart becomes strong enough to receive what it has been waiting for. Meanwhile, the person whose emotions had overflowed earlier that day was experiencing something remarkable. The uncertainty that once clouded their thoughts was beginning to lift. For the first time in a long while, peace was replacing confusion. The kind of peace that comes when someone stops resisting the truth. The kind of peace that comes when fear loses its grip. The kind of peace that comes when a person realizes they no longer want to live according to old doubts. And those happy tears? They were not only about love. They were about relief. Relief that clarity had finally arrived. Relief that what they felt was real. Relief that they no longer needed to pretend otherwise. But the most extraordinary part was still unfolding. Because at the exact moment these realizations were taking place, another person was reflecting on a promise. A promise made years ago. Not written on paper. Not announced publicly. A quiet promise carried within the heart. A promise that if the opportunity ever returned, they would not allow fear to make the decision for them. And now that opportunity appeared closer than ever. Closer than anyone realized. The phone remained untouched on the table. The call had not yet been made. Yet everyone sensed that once it happened, events would begin moving quickly. Questions would become conversations. Conversations would become decisions. Decisions would create new possibilities. The future that once felt distant would begin taking shape. And then something happened that nobody expected. A message arrived. Not from the person everyone anticipated. From someone else entirely. Someone who had no idea how significant their timing would be. The message was brief. Only a few lines. Yet those few lines contained information that changed everything. Information connected to a meeting. Information connected to plans already being discussed. Information connected to a decision that had quietly been made behind the scenes. When those words were read aloud, the room fell silent once more. Not because they were confused. Because they were astonished. The very thing they thought would take months had already begun. The door they thought was still closed was already opening. And suddenly, everyone understood why today's tears carried so much emotion. The future was no longer a distant possibility. It was becoming reality. Yet there remained one final truth. One final piece nobody had revealed. A truth connected directly to you. A truth hidden within every conversation, every memory, every realization. And when the person preparing to make that call finally spoke those words aloud, everyone in the room realized they had misunderstood one crucial detail from the very beginning. Because the person whose heart had been changing all this time was not the only one being prepared. Someone else had been prepared too. Someone whose strength, patience, and quiet faith had brought them to this exact moment. Someone listening to these words right now. And what was about to be said next would explain why the entire journey unfolded exactly the way it did.